I'm Alan Greeley, and I love thinking and meditating on Scripture. Another word for it, which we don't use very often, is pondering. When the mother of Jesus heard the shepherds retell the vision of the angels' celebratory singing, the Scripture says Mary treasured up all these things, pondering them in her heart. That alone is my goal with this podcast. I want us to treasure in our hearts what we hear from God and ponder it. It would be an honor to have you listen in and ponder with me. To God be the glory.
You have been so, so good to me.
Ponder with me about the events of September 11th and why it's an evidence for our Creator God. On September 11th, 2001, the United States was attacked by terrorists. After 23 years, it remains a life-altering event for many of us. It will go down in history as one of those days when you don't forget where you were when you found out or how you felt when you realized it was an attack. I was living in Arizona at the time, so for me it was a fairly early morning when I learned what had happened. I first found out from my mom that a plane had flown into one of the skyscrapers in New York. I didn't realize it was the Trade Center at the time. I thought it was nothing more than an accident. Then a second plane hit another skyscraper right next to it, and that's when things got really, really eerie. Two planes within a short period of time flying into buildings that were right next to each other, that couldn't be a coincidence. And then shortly thereafter, the buildings collapsed, and thousands of lives were gone in what seemed like a few moments. I got a call from my employer telling me not to come in. I was working at Discover Card at the time, and my shift was supposed to start about 10 a.m. Arizona time. And they called everyone off and told them not to arrive at work. And that's when I became glued to the news. And I knew that day how transformational, how life-altering that would be for so many. I knew it was my generation's attack on Pearl Harbor, my generation's assassination of JFK. I knew within a few hours it was going to be that type of transformational day for my generation. And as altering as it was for so many, stirring nationalism and stirring national pride, I hope that it had a deeper impact. September 11th remains to be, in my estimation, one of the greatest pieces of evidence for a creator God. I realize that one of the arguments against God has always been the question of suffering. Why would a good God allow such a thing? Why would an all-powerful God not intervene when he could intervene? And if you've ever thought about spiritual things long enough, I'm sure you've wrestled with those questions personally. I believe that those questions are fair and good. And the reason I know that they are fair and good is because believers wrestled with those exact questions in Scripture. Psalm 73 is one of those brutally honest psalms. Asaph is the writer. In Psalm 73, he's basically saying, when I thought about who suffers and who doesn't, and who is hurting and who has it comfortable, I almost fell away. That's a rough paraphrase, but listen to a few lines of Psalm 73. But as for me, my feet had almost stumbled, my steps had nearly slipped. I almost fell away, he's saying. I almost lost my faith. Well, why? What's so troubling to you, Asaph? I thought about who suffers. This is a line from verse 3, Psalm 73. I was envious of the arrogant when I saw the prosperity of the wicked. And then listen to him again in verse 5. They are not in trouble as others are. They are not stricken like the rest of mankind. Brutal honesty, isn't it? He is saying, I almost fell away and lost my faith because when I thought about the wicked winning, when I thought about the wicked having it easy, that was really troubling to me. Read the book of Habakkuk sometime. It's not long. It's only 3 chapters. You can read it over a cup of coffee. And perhaps we'll think about that book on this podcast at some point. I'd love to do that. But Habakkuk is wrestling with the very similar idea, the idea that an evil nation is about to get their way. An evil nation is going to win. An evil nation is going to dominate. And Habakkuk will basically ask, how can you, God, allow that? Listen to one of the verses from Habakkuk chapter 1. This is verse 13 rather. Why do you look idly at traitors and remain silent when the wicked swallows up a man more righteous than he? I love that about Scripture. Scripture never hides behind the hard stuff. If you look deep enough into Scripture, it is like looking into the human soul and all of our deep, dark questions. The answer to those questions, though, ultimately, is that sin is the reason for suffering, not the Lord. Regardless of who is suffering, whether it's a righteous person or an evil person, and I realize that in one aspect, Paul makes it very clear that there are none righteous. He says that very clearly in Romans chapter 3, but you understand how I'm using these phrases very broadly. Whether it's a righteous person or an evil person suffering, it is sin that caused suffering to come into the world at all. But it's vital to remember that God has intervened in his Son to reverse all the effects of sin, suffering being one of those. Sin is the source of suffering, and while God does allow it to happen in our world, he has most definitely intervened in his Son to reverse all of the death and suffering that sin has brought. A good, all-powerful God, our God, has not sat idly by. He has gotten right in the thick of it with his own Son, right down to the death of his own Son. A good, all-powerful God, our God, has not sat by and done nothing. So don't let anyone accuse God of doing nothing. But I do realize, and I am sympathetic, that those questions are tough. They are reasonable to ask when great suffering happens, especially when it hits close to home. And the closer the suffering touches you and your family, the more tempted we are to ask, how could God allow this? It's fair, and Scripture doesn't hide from those either. So there are questions that people might have raised about September 11th that drew them away from God. However, there is another aspect of those attacks on September 11th that would drive you right into the heart of God if you'll let it. Ponder this. Why were those attacks wrong? Why was it wrong to kill thousands of people? As I'm recording this episode, it's just on the heels of the school shooting in Georgia where 4 people died. Why was that wrong? No one is claiming that it's right. Why not? Why do even atheists have a sense that those things are wrong and want justice as much as anybody else? This is sometimes referred to as the morality argument, that without a creator God, there can be no right and wrong, and there can't be. And yet human beings inherently have a sense that killing people is wrong. I realize that there are sociopaths and psychopaths and mentally disturbed individuals. I understand that. Take those people away, and even the most convinced atheists have a sense of right and wrong about the things that are most basic, like murder. And I'm asking sincerely, seriously, why is that wrong? What makes murdering thousands of people in a crumbling building wrong? What makes school shootings wrong? I've seen atheists address this morality argument, do all kinds of mental gymnastics around it, but none of it makes sense to me. I watched a debate on YouTube with an atheist and a believer recently in preparation for this podcast, and when they were discussing this morality argument, the atheist said, and I quote, "We make decisions of right and wrong based on the need to enhance our lives or what would cause pain in our lives." That's a direct quote from the atheist. Anything that enhances our lives is good, he's saying. Anything that causes pain is essentially bad. But all that argument does is kick the can down the road. Because then the question becomes, what if it enhances my life, but it makes somebody else's horrible or worse? What if it enhances my life, but it takes another's life? What if it causes pain to thousands, but it enhances my life in my estimation? And if you talked with this September 11th terrorist, they would have told you that they were doing something that would have enhanced their lives, enhanced the lives of the people who had their ideology. So defining what is right and wrong based on what enhances our lives doesn't solve the issue, because everyone's definition of what enhances their life is just as scrambled. The same atheist in the same debate went on to say that we could objectively define right and wrong by what causes less harm. So he said, if we're presented 2 choices that cause harm, which of the 2 causes the lesser of the harm, and then we could objectively decide what is right. But again, that's just kicking the can down the road, because who gets to decide what is the lesser harm? If terrorists believe that murdering thousands of people is the lesser harm because they believe and they perceive America as exerting harm on the world, who gets to say that they're wrong? Why is your view better than another's? You see where we're going with this? You can't define what is right based on what enhances a life or what does less harm, because those phrases are just as subjective. If humans get to decide what is right, they also get to decide what enhances their life or what causes less harm. And if humans get to decide, Who is to say that your view is better than anyone else's? The fact is, humanity, even people who deny God, believe things like murder are wrong because God created us in His image. We are designed to be like God, and that embedded design is in all of us. Genesis 1:26, God said, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness." And the next verse, when He accomplishes that, Genesis 1:27 says, "So God created man in His own image. In the image of God, He created him, male and female, He created them." What does that mean, that we were created in His image? It can't be talking about our physical body. God is a spirit. Our physical bodies don't resemble God at all. Being made in the image of God has to be deeper than that our character was made to be like His. The purpose of our existence was made to be like His, holy, pure, loving, basically everything you see in Jesus. Jesus is the exact image, the exact representation. I'm thinking of Hebrews chapter 1. So the best definition of what it means to be created in the image of God is to be created to live and be just like Jesus. If I were to be asked by someone, "What's your purpose on earth?" I don't have to think very long about that. It's to be like Jesus. We all have that inside of us. We have that embedded, deep design of holiness, purity, and love within all humanity. And although humans might suppress it, although humans might ignore it, although humans might trash it, although humans might do everything in their power to deny it, when events like September 11th happen, and everyone knows deep down that it's wrong, and everyone deep down wants justice, we're showing that God's design is in us. It's still there.
There's no wall you won't kick down, line you won't tear down, coming after me. There's no shadow you won't light up, mountain you won't climb up, coming after me.
Thank you so much for listening. I hope you found something to treasure in your hearts and ponder. The song you've heard is Reckless Love, sung by Praise and Harmony on their album, Resurrecting God. May God's face shine on you always.
Oh, God, oh, it chases